Started today as soon as he adjusts the microphone down. I'm Keith Krause. I am the program director of the Small Arms Survey and director of the Center on Conflict Development and Peacebuilding at the Graduate Institute. And I have a couple of jobs today. The first is to introduce our two introductory speakers, and then I'm going to give a brief presentation of the report, The Global Burden of Armed Violence, and then pass things over to Sarah Sekenis to moderate the panel. So I'd first like to introduce both Michael Müller and Claude Wild, who will give us some kickoff comments. Michael Müller is the Director General ad interim of the UN office at Geneva and has been a career civil servant with the United Nations. He spent 30 years in the organization in a diverse range of roles and is both well-known in Geneva and I think a friend of the Graduate Institute as well. He most recently served also as the executive director at the Kofi Annan Foundation here in Geneva and as the deputy chief of staff in New York to the Secretary General. And his long and distinguished record would take me far too long to cover, but I'm only going to mention that he served in different capacities in Iran, in Mexico, in Haiti, and of course started in Geneva, where he was with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Claude Wild, Ambassador Wild, is the head of the Human Security Division in Bern at the Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he has been since 2010. He has also had a long career with the Swiss Diplomatic Service and has been in Brussels, Ottawa, Abuja, and Moscow, among other places, and I think is soon heading off to Vienna. Congratulations on that. And participated in UN peace operations in Namibia and the Western Sahara as part of the Swiss contingent there. So he has a long career and a lot of experience, and I think we can also count him as both a friend of the Institute and a patron of many of the organizations that are now in the Maison de la Paix. So I'm going to pass it first to Michael Müller and then to Claude Wild before I give my brief presentation.
Thank you. Mr. De Martino, Professor Krause, dear colleagues and friends. It's a pleasure to be with you for the launch of this very timely report. The need to better understand the dynamics and consequences of global armed violence, I think, cannot be overemphasized, particularly during this transition from the Millennium Development Goals to the post-2015 development agenda. Measuring violence and its impact is as challenging as it is important. I would like first and foremost to thank the researchers and the supporters who have made the report possible. 2015 is going to be a year of critical importance as we take stock of development efforts over the past 15 years and shape the new framework for the future. And if we want a truly transformative framework, then we need to be serious about including the security dimension in our discussions and our planning. When we look at news today, the far-reaching negative impact of violence and insecurity in undermining development is all too obvious. Sadly, but also unsurprisingly, the steepest declines in Human Development Index values in 2014 occurred in the Central African Republic, in Libya and Syria, all of which experienced high levels of armed violence in a conflict setting. But as the previous reports in this series have shown, conflict-related instances of armed violence, while making the news, have traditionally only been a small proportion of the global instances of armed violence. To tackle the violence, we need a holistic approach that not only reacts to crisis, but addresses the root causes of armed violence everywhere. In many places of the world, we are still faced with a circular relationship of development and armed violence, where a lack of equitable development generates the conditions in which armed violence threats, obstructing further development in the process. The United Nations has made important progress in addressing the interrelated problems of armed violence and development, not least through the efforts of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, the United Nations Development Programme, and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, as I'm sure we will hear more about later. Clearly, creating a framework that effectively constrains armed violence is a key part of the UN's efforts in promoting development. Yet, at the same time, we witness a continued decline in trust and confidence in national and international institutions that are there to hold perpetrators of armed violence accountable. New approaches to curb armed violence and enable development are therefore needed. The discussions on the post-2015 development framework and the Sustainable Development Goals provide an opportunity of recasting and expanding the scope of the discussion. To give but a few examples, new approaches need to address the fact that more people are moving to cities, where we will find an increasing large part of our armed violence challenge. The Technical Working Group on the Confluence of Urban Safety and Peacebuilding Practice, which UNOG organizes together with the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform and UN Habitat, can provide important input into this debate and will benefit from the report launched today. Similarly, a new approach needs to have a strong gender dimension. Research has shown that the estimated economic cost of violence against women is astronomical and needs much more attention. But beyond the numbers and indicators, we need to make sure that we really address the human cost of armed violence. Adequately capturing this by indicators will be one of the main challenges for the Sustainable Development Goals. Looking at the indicators you and other researchers have developed to measure armed violence and its connection to development for this and other reports through a human rights lens will help us in creating a set of results-oriented indicators. International Geneva brings together the expertise and resources to develop such indicators, collect data and monitor progress. In keeping with the unique way of doing business in Geneva, the Geneva Declaration has led the way in breaking down the silos of the security and development communities, and we need to continue making use of the experience of the range of humanitarian, development and peacebuilding actors based in Geneva who deal with armed groups in diverse settings. The Geneva Declaration on Armed Violence and Development envisaged to, quote, achieve by 2015 measurable reductions in the global burden of armed violence and tangible improvements in human security worldwide. The results of the report launched today provide us with a very valuable opportunity to evaluate if we have delivered and what we can improve in the post-2015 development agenda. I wish you a very fruitful discussion and would like to close by once again thanking and congratulating the Small Arms Survey, the Geneva Declaration Secretariat, and all the other actors involved in bringing this report together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Claude, over to you.
Mr. Director General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Switzerland highly welcomes today's gathering on the occasion of the launch of the Global Burden of Armed Violence. In the name of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, a long-standing partner of the Small Arms Survey, I warmly thank Director General Michael Muller for his opening remarks and for his personal commitment to prevention and reduction of armed violence. The need to address the interrelations between armed violence and development has long been a priority for Switzerland. For this reason, the Swiss government, along with UNDP, decided to organize a ministerial summit in Geneva in 2006. On that occasion, and you've mentioned it, Michael, the Geneva Declaration on Armed Violence and Development was adopted by 42 states, a number that has increased to this day to 113 states, more than half of the UN members. The launch of this diplomatic initiative reflected a strong political will of fostering measures to reduce armed violence in order to enhance sustainable development at a global, regional, and national level. A lot of work has been done since 2006 in promoting the objectives of the Geneva Declaration. And today, in 2015, after 9 years, we can say that the Geneva Declaration has reached important milestones. First, in advocating for the recognition of the nexus between armed violence and development, essential. Second, in developing tools for measuring armed violence reduction. Third, in providing guidance for implementation of programs and projects of armed violence prevention and reduction on the ground. In view of these achievements, I would like to sincerely thank all of our partners in this initiative, in particular the states of the core group, UNDP, and the Geneva Declaration Secretariat hosted by the Small Arms Survey. Furthermore, if in September the goal labeled Peaceful and Inclusive Societies, which currently is Goal 16 of the draft Sustainable Development Agenda, will definitively become part of the adopted agenda, then we can say that the Geneva Declaration will have accomplished one of its primary goals. Ladies and gentlemen, poverty, economic exclusion, lack of education, poor access to basic public services, youth unemployment, discrimination, racism, and gender issues are, among others, important drivers of armed violence. It is because one cannot imagine that sustainable socio-economic development can occur in situations of systemic violence, not to mention in situations of armed conflict, that Goal 16 belongs imperatively into the new development agenda. Last year, in the lead-up to the official negotiations on the post-2015 development framework, the Secretariat of the Geneva Declaration and UNDP, together with each host country, organized 5 regional review conferences of the Geneva Declaration in Guatemala, Kenya, Morocco, the Philippines, and Switzerland. The aim was to review progress in implementing the Geneva Declaration, but also to underline our commitment to work towards ending armed violence, which remains the main obstacle to sustainable peace and development. The regional review conferences have shown a broad support for the inclusion of Goal 16 into the new Sustainable Development Agenda. Thanks to these conferences, the Geneva Declaration has substantially contributed to, firstly, mainstreaming at the regional level the nexus between armed violence and development, and secondly, it has contributed to today's large recognition that armed violence prevention and reduction programs have to become a priority in the newly designed development strategies. Ladies and gentlemen, during all these years, the Small Arms Survey has played an important role in providing key support with its knowledge and expertise, especially regarding the development of public policies and the measurability of armed violence. In view of the implementation phase of the agenda, Switzerland therefore believes that the Small Arms Survey will be best positioned to offer its services to all actors who are keen on working for the effective implementation of Goal 16. The publishing of the Global Burden of Armed Violence as a concrete example of the Small Arms Survey's expertise represents the main research contribution to the measurement pillar of the Geneva Declaration. By providing more comprehensive and detailed national-level data on lethal violence, the 2015 report is an important tool for decision-makers wanting to achieve sustainable and effective policy-making at the national, regional, and global level. In conclusion, I would like to stress that I firmly believe that publications like the Global Burden of Armed Violence are vital instruments for those who work nationally and internationally on conflict transformation in order to establish more peaceful and inclusive societies. Thus, in the new post-2015 paradigm, the work of the Small Arms Survey will be more important than ever for both donors to and implementers of development and human security programs, projects, and initiatives worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to spend the next few minutes before the panel discussion walking through some of the main findings of the report. I apologize in advance for the fact that this is going to be a data-dense presentation, and I encourage you to flip through and look at any parts of it that might be of interest to you. It's the third volume in our series on the global burden of armed violence, and in each edition we attempt to shed some new light on neglected aspects of armed violence and to provide a progressively more and more comprehensive overview of the scale and distribution of lethal violence. I think the broad aim, which was summarized very well by the two preceding speakers, is to underline the ways in which high levels of insecurity are a major impediment to human, social, and economic development. We also, I think, want to counteract the somewhat rosy picture that you get from people who focus only on, for example, conflict deaths and war-related violence, who are presenting a vision of an ever-growingly peaceful world. And we want to support the drive to evidence-based programming, which I think is probably the key message to take away. I think I should remind you as well that until recently, and in part because of the Geneva Declaration work, until recently, information and statistics on violence and insecurity was difficult to gather, not always publicly available, politically sensitive, and subject to manipulation. Some of those things are still true for different parts of the world. So the launch of this report is just one step, part of our ongoing efforts to encourage and push states for greater transparency in this area. And as you already know, of course, this coincides with the 2015 negotiations on the framework for Sustainable Development Goals after the Millennium Development Goal period. I'm going to present a view of the key findings. I'm going to do it from a global perspective, and then I'm going to go and zoom in on particular issues and regions. But I first want to say one thing about how we go about this work. We adopt what we could call an integrated approach to armed violence. There are some organizations that count only casualties in armed conflicts or in specific settings. There's others that monitor homicides and criminal-related violence. But we integrate violent deaths across all settings to provide a sort of crucial comparative indicator of relative peacefulness or relative insecurity. So we're counting victims in both large and small wars, in collective and political violence below the level of formal armed conflict, in struggles between large-scale trafficking organizations and gangs, as victims of economically motivated violence, interpersonal and gender-based violence, or in encounters with state officials. So we think only with a holistic perspective to start with can you then zoom in on specific types of violence that may be most affecting particular places. We also do this because in the real world, the lines between criminally motivated and politically motivated violence are often blurry or non-existent. So this is a somewhat unique approach to measuring and monitoring of armed violence, and I think it's one of the strong points of our work. Let me start with the headline statistic. Our report estimates that at least 508,000 people died violently each year between 2007 and 2012. That gives you a global average death rate of 7.4 per 100,000, and I want you to keep that number in mind because virtually every other number I provide will refer to deaths per 100,000. The good news is that this represents a decline of about 3% from our previous edition in 2011, although there has been a spike upwards in conflict-related violence, mainly due to the wars in the Middle East. Now, of course, this total, which is the lethal burden of violence, does not come close to capturing the overall burden both of people who are physically injured or psychologically harmed from violence and those who carry the scars of it for years. But it is a decent proxy indicator that allows us to make some comparisons. Now, there's many ways to estimate the economic costs of armed violence, and we've devoted an entire chapter to looking at this. At the very most expansive end, you could include all of the costs that are associated with providing security, military spending, policing, criminal justice, public health expenditures that are associated with violence. And these estimates are very huge and highly uncertain. So one organization, the Institute for Economics and Peace, has done just that. They've added up absolutely everything, and they've come up with an estimate of the cost of preventing violence and providing security at somewhere around $9 trillion a year. The problem is that many of those costs, such as providing policing or having a functioning criminal justice system, these are actually necessary expenditures in an imperfect world. So I think we need to have a slightly more narrowly focused take on what the real costs of armed violence are. And we chose to focus on the calculable impact of violence on life expectancy and economic productivity, which is to say, measuring the loss associated with lethal violence. These are tangible effects, and by this benchmark, violent deaths in non-conflict settings represented $171 billion in lost productivity. Now, another way to look at this, which perhaps might also help in the process of setting reasonable targets, is to ask yourself, how many lives would be saved if global violence death rates, this 7.4 per 100,000, were reduced to the average level of, let's call it, an ordinary country, which we would calculate as a rate of around 2.3 per 100,000. This is not the rate of the most peaceful countries in the world, the lowest quintile, which are mostly advanced industrial states, and countries in Western Europe would have violent death rates of around 1 per 100,000. But it's the death rate in average in second quintile countries, which are so-called ordinary states with relatively low levels of violence. And by that standard, we would be able to save, or would have been able to save, 3 million lives between 2000 and 2010. In some particular countries in Central and Latin America, life expectancies would have been 1 full year greater if violence levels were reduced to these ordinary country levels. So these are real human costs. Now, what does the picture look like when we chart the overall distribution of global violence? From a global perspective, violence is highly concentrated in particular states and specific regions, and that's clear from this map here, which is going to highlight the most violent places. 18 countries have rates greater than 30 per 100,000, and that's more than 4 times the global average over this period of 2007 to 2012. These 18 countries are home to only about 280 million people, or somewhat less than 4% of the world's population. So violence is highly concentrated in specific parts of the world. 1/4 of the deaths in places where only 5% of the world's population lives. Now, there's a further 19 countries that have death rates greater than 10 per 100,000, and those are the other 2 blue shades. So if you take the 3 darkest blue shades, you end up with 37 countries that are concentrated in parts of Latin America, Africa, and South Asia. Among this group, only about 1/3 of them were experiencing armed conflict. Now, we can see some positive changes since the previous edition. At the regional level, rates have been declining everywhere, with the exception of Central America and Southern Africa. And overall, almost 3/4 of 189 countries are in the low or very low categories of armed violence. If we look at the 12 countries that are most affected by armed violence, what do we see? Well, not surprisingly, countries at war were and are among the most severely affected, and And this is the case for Syria, which had more than 180 deaths per 100,000, and Afghanistan, which is greater than 40 per 100,000. This data only goes up to 2012, and of course we know that there's been a significant upsurge in violence in the Middle East, around Syria and the central Middle Eastern area since then. So the picture may even be slightly more bleak for Syria and Iraq. But almost all of the other countries here are not at war, and many of them are in Central America and Latin America. Honduras and Venezuela, just to pick two of the top examples, have violent death rates that are 10 times the global average and are comparable to those in war zones. Now, this shows up also in the overall data on armed violence. Only about 70,000 of the global total of more than 500,000 violent deaths occurred in zones of armed conflict, and the remaining 438 in so-called non-conflict settings. Now, the label that's often used to describe these 430,000 deaths is homicide, which is a legal category. But I think that in addition to it being only a legal category that leaves a lot of important things out, it conjures up an image of sort of interpersonal violent exchanges between individuals over specific criminal or economically motivated things. And it doesn't capture very well the large-scale non-conflict violence that you see in places such as northern Nigeria or parts of Mexico. So we really need another way to understand this, and this is one of the reasons we adopt the language of armed violence as opposed to simply talking about conflict or homicidal violence. So this total includes large and small-scale organized and interpersonal violence, as well as deaths in legal interventions at the hands of state agents, which is about 4% of the total. People who, of course, are killed in the course of interactions with police officers or other state officials, and they will not figure in homicide statistics because these are often not legally challengeable deaths. Now, compared to our previous report, these numbers represent an upsurge in conflict-related violence in regions of the world that we all are familiar with from the headlines. So what are the key messages from this overview? Well, the first is that most contemporary violence is not taking place in conflict zones. Most of the states worst affected by armed violence are not at war. Levels of armed violence in non-conflict settings are higher than in most war zones. And much of the violence, but we really don't know how much, is organized, non-random, and in some sense connected with broader conflict and criminal or economically motivated dynamics. It's not interpersonal in the narrow sense, but it's part of a larger dynamic of conflict and crime. Now, one of the important characteristics that this national level data and this global picture obscures is the tremendous variation within states and the concentration of violence in particular zones and regions. And this holds true both in conflict and non-conflict settings. And the following couple slides will illustrate this quite well. In Syria, for example, the majority of the deaths between 2011 and 2014, which we do have slightly better data for that, have been concentrated in and around the Damascus governorate and also in the northern border areas, with high levels of violence also recorded in the areas nearer to Iraq. The picture would have actually become slightly bleaker in recent months and years. I should say that these are absolute numbers in the case of Syria and not rates, and one of the reasons is that very high levels of population displacement have made it extremely difficult to calculate rates because you have a large number of people who have left and don't have good local statistics anymore. What is clear is the extraordinary insecurity in many of the dense urban areas. And this information, which can be taken down to even a more fine-grained georeference level, has been proven extremely useful for humanitarian actors and others who are targeting assistance to high-risk and vulnerable communities. When we contrast this with Central America, and here the map shows Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador put together. The borders are marked but are very unclear here. We see a similar kind of pattern, concentration of violence, and the rates are given here now in per 100,000, along coastal areas and in border zones, regions that are particularly prone to the activities of large-scale gangs and transnational organizations that are engaged in trafficking and smuggling or intense struggles over turf. And they operate also where state institutions are particularly weak. The two little towns that you see marked on, that you did see a moment ago, marked on there. We're right across the border. El Ferrito and Copan are on opposite sides of the border, and the violence rates on those sides are extremely high, up to 280 per 100,000 in these areas. Now, there's also major differences in the distribution of violence in urban settings, as the next couple of slides show. In the United States, for example, which has a moderate rate of overall lethal violence of around 4 per 100,000, which puts it at the high end for advanced industrial states, but well below the global average. There's a great deal of variation that depends on the size of the cities. Mid-sized cities, with roughly between 500,000 and 1 million inhabitants, have the highest incidence of violence, with rates that are 3 times the national average and well above the global average. These are, again, rates that go up to 10. And this is unusual for advanced industrial states. Some specific cities, such as Detroit and New Orleans, have violent death rates that are greater than 40 per 100,000, which, again, if you think about that in comparative terms, is well above the global average and starts to approach some of the levels of the most violent places on the planet. And these places, such as Detroit and New Orleans, are suffering, of course, from economic crisis and depopulation and all sorts of other systemic tensions. What we don't know enough about, however, is the overall distribution and relationship between cities and their countrysides so that we can make good generalizations about urban-related violence. And we can't claim that cities are uniquely violent or understand why some of them are much more violent than others. There's a whole host of other factors at work here. And the case of cities in Brazil provides an excellent example of that. This slide shows the change in homicide rates, lethal violence rates, in 9 different state capitals, listed along the bottom, since 2000. What we did is normalize the rate of violence to 100 for every state or every capital in 2004, and then just charted how much it had gone up or gone down. So these are not comparable rates per se, but they tell you about change over time. So we have major cities such as Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro experiencing significant declines of between 70 and 56%, the 2 lines on the bottom part of the chart, while other cities have seen major increases by 50% or more over those years. Now, we do know that in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, there have been some innovative and quite useful programs in violence prevention and reduction that have been tried there and not necessarily elsewhere in Brazil. But we don't have a really good sense of what works and what doesn't work in some of the different areas in Brazil. And this kind of highlights the way in which disaggregated data, both temporally and geographically, is becoming crucial, and it's more and more available, but it's also becoming crucial for developing practical programs and evaluating whether or not they are actually successful. Now, what about the instruments of violence? Here we focus in on firearms specifically, and our count is that 44% worldwide, 44% of violent deaths involve the use of firearms. It's slightly above that level for homicides, and it's a little bit below that level, around 32%, for conflict deaths, although it's quite difficult to get an accurate assessment of the use of firearms in conflict settings. But either way, they are the single most frequently used method to kill, even though it doesn't surpass 50%. All other instruments come in much lower. Here, too, there is also a wide variation between different regions and different settings. And this chart compares the overall homicide rate with the proportion that involves firearms for several high-violence countries. All of these countries have violent death rates greater than 15 per 100,000 and are well above the global average. And these are all in Latin America and the Caribbean, with the exception of South Africa. So at the extreme end, which is both Honduras and then further down the chart, Guatemala, firearms are involved in more than 80% of the lethal violence, the red band, and the remaining thin green line indicates only the proportion of deaths that's not due to firearms. And in other countries with high rates of lethal violence, such as South Africa along the bottom, firearms play a role in only half of the lethal incidents, and knives and other bladed weapons are proportionally more important in that context. Now, we see the same kind of variability in countries that have low levels of lethal violence, not just the ones that are at the top of our scale, but ones that are not on the chart. So in Eastern Europe and East Asia, firearms account for only about 10% of the lethal exchanges. In Southern Europe, on the other hand, which similar rates of violence to Eastern Europe, firearms account for more than 40% of the deaths. So here, even within Europe, you have tremendous variation. And what this suggests is that there are a number of other factors at work, which include, of course, the legislative framework that governs firearms regulation, the overall level of firearms ownership, the ease with which they can be obtained, which isn't the same thing as levels of ownership, because you can sometimes obtain weapons quite easily even if you don't have them, and the nature of the violence that these countries are experiencing. Now, this slide illustrates that overall, there's only a very weak relationship between firearms and violence. If there was an absolutely crystal clear link, as a country's rate of homicide went up along the bottom axis, then there should also be an increase along the top in the rate of firearms violence. So we have some kind of line that went from the bottom left to the upper right. This is obviously not the case even from eyeballing it, although there is a bit of a trend line. In the upper right quadrant are countries that are mostly in Latin America and the Caribbean. High rates of violence and high rates of firearms use. There's a lot of variation, however, in the lower left, where you have countries that in general have low levels of violence, but the proportion that firearms account for varies from 50% or more down to almost zero. Now, leaving aside the relationship here, it's worth underlining that firearms violence does not only claim victims directly, that is to say, guns don't only kill people, but are also responsible for injuries and long-lasting physical and psychological effects, including long-term disabilities. Firearms violence tends to have much greater costs as a result of that. Now, the global burden of armed violence also devotes a chapter to charting the lethal dimension of violence against women. I think we all know that it's critical to disaggregate not just by geography and by time, but also by gender and other demographic characteristics of the victims. But for many countries, this information is not publicly available. There are some in which it's available but not made public. And so we've built our global estimates here based on data from 104 different countries. And on this basis, we calculate that there's around 60,000 women victims of lethal violence each year between 2007 and 2012. We don't have good enough data to disaggregate the figures in conflict settings, but in places such as Afghanistan, where the UN Assistance Mission has collected such figures, roughly 10% of the victims of conflict-related violence are women, but we don't know how many women are victims of other forms of violence, which are, of course, rather extreme in some of those settings. So this map mirrors the earlier one, but now is focusing only on female victims. And the distribution of high and low levels looks roughly similar, with a few exceptions. You will note Russia at the top is higher than it would be for overall levels. One thing that you will notice, and is a crucial point for future policymaking, is that we have very little data in Africa and large parts of Asia, which I think highlights the importance of pushing. I think some of it is collected but not made public, and in many places there's just no data available. Now this slide starts to unpack the figures by looking at variation in the proportion of female homicides in overall deaths. So we have the total homicide on the green bar and the proportion that is accounted for by female homicides in the red. Well, again, Central America and the Caribbean stand out, first two bars on the left, for their relatively high levels of female victimization compared to other regions of the world. If we leave those two areas aside, what's interesting is that the variation in female homicide across the world is much smaller than the variation in overall levels of violence. So there's kind of a baseline of violence, lethal violence against women, that is probably also true for violence against women in general, that seems to be incompressible across different regions. It does not vary nearly as much. Aside from these overall levels, what we don't know much about is how the dynamics of violence against men and women might be linked in either conflict or non-conflict or high and low violence settings. But it's important to examine this because, as Maria Stern has pointed out in a study of Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, the specific and almost exclusive focus on sexual and gender-based violence alone is problematic because it hinders our understanding of the relationship between sexual violence and other forms of violence. And we need to see this in a holistic way in order to even tackle one aspect of this problem. This challenge is pretty clearly illustrated, and I've picked the case of Mexico rather than a conflict-related case, when we look at individual cases. So, by the way, I should say there are two different axes. So the male homicide rate, which is the blue line, is the rate on the right-hand side, and the green line is the female homicide rate in Ciudad Juarez, and the scale is on the left-hand side. The overall rate of female homicides in Mexico is along the bottom here. But what does this slide tell us? Well, we see that the spikes in both male and female homicides track each other almost perfectly. The male homicide rate peaked in 2010 at more than 500 per 100,000. Keep in mind, again, the figures for global averages. And the female homicide rate peaked at just under 50 per 100,000, which also is like in many war zones. Now, if violence against women were purely part of the private sphere and subject to separate dynamics and separate processes, we would not expect these two lines to move together. So this suggests, at least, that in very violent settings, violence is part of a much larger dynamic of what occurs in public spaces. But that's about all we know about this. We cannot say much more at this point. Now, in the past few minutes, I painted a fairly depressing and statistically rich picture of violence and insecurity around the world. It's not a uniformly bleak picture, and I'll try and end on a slightly more positive note, because there has been a noticeable decline in overall levels of lethal violence since 2004. And we now are starting to have good enough data over time that is allowing us to track these kinds of changes. This is clearly going to be crucial for moving forward in the post-2015 period. There's also been important and sometimes very dramatic improvements in security and safety in many cities and in many countries, in particular in parts of Latin America and Asia. And in this volume, we did not look, although we did in 2011, at some of the practical and concrete programs and measures that have been put in place to address specific drivers of violence. But I want to just draw attention here to three things, or three areas, for future work here. The first is that all stakeholders need to develop a deeper understanding of the specific characteristics of violence and insecurity. We know a lot more than we did about the global scope than we did a decade ago, but data, even if it's gathered globally, needs to be actionable at the local level. And many national and local governments have recognized the need for very context-specific information on victims, perpetrators, and weapons, which is obviously the who, what, where, when, why, and how of armed violence. This is a basic foundation for effective policy and programming. The second thing we need is systematic information on best practices, on what has and has not worked, and in particular what has not worked, in different places. There are a whole host of innovative and practical programs that have been tried, but we desperately need to draw together information from quite disparate communities, from the public health community, which the WHO is leading in some of its work on the Violence Prevention Alliance, to the criminal justice community, which includes not just focus on violence, but also on effective policing and security sector reform, and the sort of post-conflict peace-building communities, where there are a lot of programs undertaken. In each of these communities, and there are others, there's a wealth of quite disconnected information on policies and programs, and no systematic overview, no global scan of what works. I personally can't think of any other global bad that is operating on such a weak evidence base for policy and programming. The third thing we need is to strengthen the capacity for monitoring and evaluating programs that promise to improve security and enhance safety and build peaceful societies. Too much work, even today, still relies on fairly flimsy ideas about awareness raising or capacity building without really identifying the drivers of violence or working with a fairly robust theory of change and having good benchmarks for measuring progress. I don't underestimate the difficulty in moving towards that kind of programming, but it's a necessary step, especially to achieve the implementation of Goal 16, should it be approved. Let me just conclude with a couple of observations about the international context, and I think I'm going to echo here what our two first speakers said. When the United Nations member states approved in 2000 the Millennium Declaration, it included not only baskets on development and poverty reduction, human rights, and environmental sustainability, it also included a chapter on promoting peace and security. But the benchmarks that were adopted in the Millennium Development Goals did not include any specific goals, targets, and indicators to reduce insecurity and promote peaceful societies. It took 15 years for us to deliver the message, strongly and in many different forums, that violence and insecurity, which are bad things in themselves, also have a negative impact on development in all of its aspects. And the World Bank highlighted this in 2011 when they pointed out in their annual report that no low-income, fragile, or conflict-affected country had at that point achieved a single Millennium Development Goal. So these are not separate processes. They're integrally linked to the achievement of development objectives. I know that violence and insecurity is messy, difficult and politically sensitive to deal with. But all of our policies, including in particular development policies, are going to have to tackle complex, messy, and difficult topics if they want to achieve their goals. So there's a whole agenda here, which I think, inshallah, post-September, we will be able to look forward to promoting in the context of the 2015 Security and Development Goals. Thank you. I'm now going to pass the floor to Sarah Sekenes, who gets to moderate the panel, and I think you want to invite the panelists to come up. Only if they're hard questions.
If I can have two on each side, perhaps. Can you all hear me if I speak without microphone? No. No.
It's for recording.
But they can't record it.
Recording.
Do you want the earbuds?
I think I'll just... Okay, I appear to need this one for the recording. First of all, thank you to the presentation, Keith, and thanks for previous speakers as well. And I think I will start by just introducing the panel. It consists of the co-chairs of the Geneva Declaration Initiative, as well as representation from the Small Arms Survey. So we have Neil Boone. He's the director of the UNDP office in Geneva. Before that, he was also director of the Geneva Liaison Office for the Crisis Prevention and Recovery Area, which worked specifically with our Swiss counterparts on armed violence prevention. He's also served as the UN resident coordinator in 3 different countries for 12 years. Most recently in Sri Lanka, previous to that in Bulgaria and in Belarus. And before that, he spent 15 years in various capacities around the world with UN. He has a master from the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Marcus from SDC, our Swiss counterpart on this initiative. He's the Senior Policy Advisor on Conflict and Human Rights from the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation. He's also the focal point for conflict and human rights at the Swiss Agency and heads the SDC's network on conflict and human rights, for which fragility is a main topic. In 2007 to 2010, he was a special advisor for peacebuilding Nepal of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs and worked on the peace process on the political level and support to the constitution making and expertise on federalism and also on security sector reform. Prior to that, he worked as a consultant in various forms for the GTZ, for the Austrian government, and also for the SDC itself. He's also worked in country in Sri Lanka. You have that one in common. And in a number of conflict-affected situations for the Swiss Foreign Ministry. Switzerland has also just recently taken over the co-chair for the OECD DAC network on conflict and fragility, the INCAF, together with UNDP, in which I know Marcus is active. And last but not least, we have Anna Alvazi de Frate. She's a research director at the Small Arms Survey, and she has a degree in psychology, postgraduate diploma in sociology and research methodology, and a doctorate in criminology from the University of Bologna in Italy. Professionally, she's worked as a research officer at the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, the UNICRI, and the United Nations Office for Drug and Crimes Control, the UNODC. She's currently the research director at the Small Arms Survey, and her main areas of research include crime prevention, crime statistics, corruption, transnational organized crime and illegal markets, comparative criminal justice systems, and gender-related issues. So that's a bit of the massive background of our panelists here today. I also wanted to say that Keith remains here in case there are questions later on with the specificities of the report. And I also know that we have some of the researchers and authors in the audience who can help on specific issues. But the overall themes that we wanted to address in this panel, and I know that we are a little bit late, so I'm going to hand the word over to them successfully to just tell us a little bit over a few minutes, why is this relevant? Why is this important to, why should we bother about armed violence and prevention of armed violence? And we'll do it within the context of 3 themes: the successes and challenges in violence and development policymaking and programming. Some of the aspects that Keith mentioned was of importance to look at what works and what doesn't. We'll look at Goal 16, which has been mentioned a number of times, its importance and how to implement it. And we also heard a lot on data on armed violence reduction and prevention. How can data be used for development and armed violence reduction and prevention? What capacities do we need to build such data and related monitoring systems? But before that, I think I'll just hand over in the order of Neil, Marcus, and then Anna, to say a few words for why we should keep our attention directed to this panel here today. So Neil, you have the word.
Yeah, I like that Keith ended on something positive, because I've been through some pretty horrible things, so it's good to actually put them in historical context. I mean, there's another big book that I read at bedtime over the last year called Our Angels of Better Nature by Steven Pinker, which essentially says that in the long run, well, first it says that there's lots of terrible, horrible things that have happened and great negative effects on development from violence, as this report says, but it also says the long-term trend is positive. So to put that in the context a little bit of these Sustainable Development Goals, I think you know that there's this famous 17 goals, but they've actually been distilled in a synthesis report into 6 different elements. One of these elements talks about dignity, which essentially is trying to end the extremes there are in the world in terms of inequity, extreme poverty. A second element is about people, which is about trying to ensure that there's basic safety nets in place. The third element is about prosperity. The fourth element is about the planet, saving the planet. The fifth is on partnerships, but the last is on justice. And on the justice element, it recognizes what's in Goal 16, but is a bit broader than that, that fundamentally development is also about rights being observed. Development is about peace. And from that, I think that's where this particular report becomes relevant. Because if you actually even go back to the United Nations Charter, it tries to integrate issues of peace and development and social justice and human rights. These 6 elements in the Secretary General's synthesis report from the SDGs tries to show how everything is linked as well, in all good, positive ways. But if you actually look at the violent deaths that are happening right now as we talk, whether it's in conflict or out of conflict, they're sort of the antithesis of all these goals that we're trying to work towards. With, as the report says, 1.5 billion people affected, with countries overwhelmed, not being able to deal with the issue. Keith talked about the 500,000 people who are dying every year. So fundamentally, what's happening is that this level of continued violence in a world with broader development, with accelerated development, actually undoes development. And you could make an argument with the speed with which development moves forward and the complexity in the world right now, that this undoing is actually more destructive than it may have been in the past, and it takes longer to put things together. And hence, the importance of prevention, hence the importance of, well, the fact that Goal 16 itself is big progress. As Keith said, although the Millennium Declaration in 2000 talked about these issues, it wasn't reflected in the goals. Now it's in the goals. And hence the importance of this report, which actually does something that's very important if you're going to try to meet a goal as ambitious as this, which is try to measure things and to show what the reality is, to show what the evidence is. So we very much in UNDP welcome this report. It fits into the commitment that we've made over the last years on the Geneva Declaration. As Sarah said, it fits into the partnership we have now with the Swiss government on the New Deal and INCAF, as it's called. It fits into work that we do with other agencies on being the global focal point on rule of law and justice issues, mainly with DPKO and OHCHR, Department of Peacekeeping Operations, Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, if you don't know the acronyms. So, I mean, this report lays out an agenda which is something that needs to be followed if we're going to meet our objectives in UNDP. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. And I hand the word over directly to Marcus.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the first reason to be here is to express also for SDC, which is part of the Foreign Department, the high appreciation of this report, of the fact that you collect, contextualize, and explain facts and information in a way that makes it easier or more objective or neutral to discuss them. I think that's the thing. And the main reason is not because we have been able to co-financing it. And maybe just to reflect from the STC as a development and humanitarian agency, why this topic is very relevant. I think earlier it was like this, that development agency said, we cannot work over there, it is a bit difficult, you know, let's go to this other country. I exaggerate here, but that situation is no more. And over the past 10, 15 years, the problematic has really grown, that we have more and more working in these fragile and conflict situations. This is also because majority or close to majority of poor people are there. So there is no different fragility agenda to the poverty agenda, if you want, which means that at the end, to work on poverty means to work on fragility and on violent conflicts. That has been an experience of most of the development actors, and I would say the latest common response in a way which is quite ambitious is the so-called New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States. I mention it here because it was launched end of 2011. It was it is a negotiated also text, as an ambitious program, negotiated between in the meantime 20 fragile governments and the OECD DAC donors, and it asks us to work on mainly 5 main objectives if we work in difficult situations. That is on political inclusion, on security, on personal security, on justice, and then of course on economic and state delivery themes as well. And PSG, peace and state building, goal number 2 is personal security, and I think that's how we look at it from our experiences with the people in our partner countries, that personal security is, if it's not there, personal insecurity is an obstacle for development efforts, and it is in a way, it has to be made a development goal itself. So there, of course, armed violence is one of the sources of that personal insecurity. In that sense, I would say we are quite proud to report that even not only the New Deal is still alive. We will have a steering group meeting in Abidjan in 10 days. I think don't know whether you will be there, Magdi will be there as our co-chair. And we hope that the next phase of the New Deal can then be endorsed next year at the ministerial level. Also from SDC, we have now a new peace building and state building strategy. It is quite important to report about this here because it makes it mandatory for all our programs in more than half of our partner countries, which are fragile and conflict affected, to really work mainly towards peace building and state building, to this out of fragility, to work on the root causes. It's not just a declaration anymore, and we have now our instruments to avoid, that the technical work like building roads or bridges or something like that is just good for itself. No, it has to show that it contributes to long-term out of fragility or conflict transformation goals. That is very ambitious, but if we don't do that, I think as a trade development actors get a little bit irrelevant. Why do I say this? Because if you look at these days at the big picture, what do you see, this difficult world of 2014 and now? In a way, we have now a growing two patterns which seem to overshadow everything else. One is I would say, the humanitarian response, no? I mean, it's sort of a chronification of humanitarian responses, patterns, in, out, no? And the other one, of course, is now, with regard to security and violence, is this, well, I'm not saying to replay the 9/11 game, but something like going more and more with this type of military security means. And in that respect, I think the long-term engagement-related orientation on peace building and state building is really it's a good chance now to explain that this is important. It will be there, and in that sense also SDG 16 is a good chance. We have to work on it, and to end here that first small round, I would say also say that congratulations that you know, in a way, what the Geneva Declaration was is a coalition of the willing, no? After it hadn't been possible for the Millennium Declaration to go on your own and to influence others, and it happened, no? Maybe for different reasons. It was maybe not only the Geneva Declaration, but at the end, we have now SDG 16, or at least we have it almost, I would say. And I think your experience and know-how on this data management will at least, should at least influence very strongly, I say, two indicators of that particular target, which is possible, because the SDG 16 is also not perfect. Some of the targets which we would like to have are not in there, but I think that's now a main task from your history, to influence that. I mean, you have already started, you will tell us right now. And in that sense, I think we are making progress, but even if the world looks very in dire straits at the moment.
Thank you, Marcus. Anna, you've just heard from two actors that are a coalition of the willing, if you wish. Are all actors out there like that? You sit on crunching a lot of the data. You have an insight that is broader than most of us. Is this representative?
Hopefully. No, actually, this is for us something that is the basis of our work. We believe strongly in the power of data, you know, and we were very happy that at the same time that the Sustainable Development Goals are being discussed, there is a push for the data revolution to support them. And this is a very important process because data are part of a process of change that includes transformation, that includes transparency, accountability, and inclusion. So it speaks directly to the goal 16 of more peaceful and inclusive societies. It's not by chance that in goal 16 you have a basic right like birth registration is part of goal 16. And you also have the other side of the coin, that is accounting for violent deaths. That is the other end of the spectrum, what we try to do with the global burden of armed violence, that is taking violent deaths in total, in any context in which they occur. What we see in this interesting time is that many actors have started realizing the importance of this process, and as Marcus said, the issue of the indicators, this one that we're dealing with is perhaps the first and the most important indicator towards peace. Although there is no specific indicators on peace in Goal 16, there is the opposite, that is a trend towards a reduction of violence, a measurable reduction of violence, which was already the goal of the Geneva Declaration when it was established in 2006. So the two processes really largely overlap, and this is why we are so much engaged into them.
Thank you, Anna. So we've heard a little bit of the context and the backdrop against why we should be listening to the rest of this panel. Digging into a little bit of the details that Keith brought out, we see that the levels of violence has overall decreased, but that we see an upsurge of lethal violence in the context of conflict since 2011. What does this mean? Does it mean that countries are becoming better at preventing homicides in non-conflict settings, but that armed conflicts are getting more violent and disregards international humanitarian law? A few words on that, if I can hand the word over to Neil first.
Yeah, I think, in short, the answer is yes to both questions. In preventing homicides in non-conflict settings, I mean, there are fewer variables involved, and there are lots of good initiatives that have borne fruit. UNDP's had a program in El Salvador over the last years that worked with gang leaders, and through that, bringing them more into the mainstream, it's reduced the amount of violence in those areas of El Salvador that were earlier being blighted. There's all sorts of examples. I mean, when I was a kid in Canada, I grew up across the river from the city Detroit that was mentioned as one of the problems. At the same time, I remember going to Detroit as a young to New York as a young JPO, and walking down the street and people swinging chains in front of me, and a robbery happening while I was trying to buy, I think, yogurt-covered raisins or something in a shop in New York. And now, if you go to New York City, I mean, it's reasonably safe. Unfortunately, Detroit's not. So public policy can make a difference in reducing homicides. All sorts of things can make a difference in reducing homicides. Not that it's easy. And there's many places where it is getting worse. However, with armed conflicts, the variables are much more. And I think a combination of more armed conflicts happening in urban areas, as we've seen in Syria, the use of more larger explosive weapons in urban areas. Sometimes, I wouldn't say the disregard for human life is necessarily greater now than in the past, because there's been some pretty terrible things happening in the past, but there still is a willingness to sacrifice civilians for military objectives, or even to use them as a shield, as I saw during my years in the middle of a horrible, horrible situation in Sri Lanka. So I think, in short, Sarah, the answer is yes. Homicides can be reduced. There is positive action. Preventing deaths in conflict is more complicated in our faster moving world, with more people living in urban areas and nastier weapons available.
Thank you, Neil. Marcus, do you have some views on this?
No, if your reports tendency, we will anyway accept it. That's the thing. Now the question is, I'm not in a real. I don't have the know-how to really comment on why such things are at the moment happening. Can only confirm in the case now, for instance. We are talking about country programs in our agency. I mean, you have to see it also in a very practical way. Global figures are important. They have to be measured, in particular if we really go towards SDG 16. But at the end, it will be national figures that will count. No? You have to convince France and Austria and Mali that these are indicators that you can measure in your country, and without being just without just being compared to everyone else. Otherwise, they will not really do it. We saw that in the history of indicators to the PSG in the New Deal, it was very difficult, if not impossible, to agree on global indicators, at least not on the political side. No, that's why it's good that now the technical people, the experts, are discussing on the future of the SDG 16 indicators. Now, regarding the situation that you have if you are working in a country as a development partner, there, of course, the context-specific analysis is key. And sometimes you might have some of the data, sometimes you might even benefit also from your data, but at the end, it's an overall analysis that you have to do, and then to make a decision what is now really the most relevant field to work on if you want to contribute to outer fragility and conflict transformation, and not just to do what you always did, let's say, do this type or the other type of technical projects. Now, this is change happening, at least within the organization. In our case in Honduras, that there was a change now, 3 years ago, now to put security as a main topic for Honduras. It looks very obvious if you know at all these figures, but to really make that change in an organization which is full of people with a lot of experiences and not the stupid technicians, but then mainly on one particular trade, that's not so easy. So therefore we cannot already report of big successes, but we will take that figure also on our plate because it's the mixture, as it was described from UNDP, a mixture on working and public security with mid-size cities, for instance, including but also with the police programs, working with police, interested police corps, and a lot of this type of thing, even with the Inter-American Bank. But the focus is on the security of the persons, the personal security. And in that sense, it's interesting for us to have that type of figures. Also, you can take a completely different country like Nepal. I take it because I worked there, so it's easy to talk about. No one. We were not putting any specific focus on armed violence. Even though we were discussing it, it was the time when the first report came out, but we were analyzing the thing, personal security, that we were. And I would still say that Nepal has made progress. They came out of an armed of a war, and they were able to at least work together to some extent. It's imperfect, but this is, on the other hand, a country which is still classified fragile, but they don't like the word, but it is in our understanding, where progress could be made to a certain degree. Just maybe these two examples.
Thank you, Marcus. Anna, from your point of view, we heard Keith said earlier that the continuum between homicides and conflicts, in which you find this whole broader concept of armed violence, is it becoming blurred? Is this therefore also more difficult today to look at the applicability of international humanitarian and human rights law?
Well, I wouldn't say that it is becoming, it is blurred. You know, so it's something that is not perfect because the world outside is like that and the situations change very quickly. So this is also an answer to the previous question. So there are peaks of violence that are connected to conflicts. Keith showed you the picture of the 2012, year 2012, where Syria was at the top. If he showed you 2011, Libya was there with even higher rates than what you found for Syria in 2012. But then Libya went down because luckily there was a rapid decrease. So the situation is really blurred. And what is important to see is these situations where there is this protracted post-conflict that remains very, very violent, in which it's very difficult to intervene because it's not a situation of open conflict in which it's possible to apply international humanitarian law in a clear way, but it's really complicated also from the point of view of policy and programming.
Thank you, Anna. I know we touched upon the aspects of fragility already. It's been mentioned both by Neil and by Marcus. And the global burden of armed violence shows that while global levels of violent deaths are decreasing, the economic costs of violence is increasing. Keith also explained that if you consider lost productivity, the longer, safer, and more productive people's lives become, the higher the impact of violence. What does this mean in terms of development priorities? If I could direct it to Neil. You're pointing at each other.
It's for all of us. He's UN. No.
Well, I think what it means is that low-level development doesn't equal a likelihood of violence. Middle-income countries are, can be as prone as any. I mean, you just have to look in Europe right now with the terrible tragedy happening around Ukraine, and the people that you see being affected are, they may not be wealthy, but they would fit most definitions we would have of middle income. So it's not something that is isolated to any place. But I think one element is also, I think, the nature of the economies that and the economic system we have right now. So the loss from violence, I mean, isn't simply in terms of infrastructure. It's also in terms of how those economies and people interact with other people. So in one sense, if you have damage in one middle-income country, it may affect the development in a neighboring country. It may affect the supply chain. The other element is, of course, I talked earlier about undoing development. And with economies and societies where there's more and more value put on knowledge, on education, more and more complicated health systems, the damage that extreme violence can do actually is perhaps exponentially increased. So you may have a situation where perhaps in absolute numbers, and this is still dicey as the report shows, you have a decrease in violence, but actually the economic costs, both within the society and to the region and perhaps the world as a whole, is actually considerably more. I mean, there's an OECD report that came out recently on fragility, and it tries to contribute to this debate on how we implement the SDGs, but particularly Goal 16. And it talks about 50 most vulnerable countries, and it includes several middle-income countries, not only ones that are affected by conflict, but also middle-income countries that are affected by high levels of crime and the economic impact that has as well. In the report, I think Keith's introduction, he makes a reference slightly provocative to say, well, maybe in some cases, violence actually increases development. But then I think shortly after that, he says, well, that's not exactly right. There might be some instances where war economies create a bubble, get people out of the depression or whatever, but once conflict starts, it doesn't contribute to development.
Thank you, Neil. Marcus, you mentioned also the OECD report on fragility and how it contributes to a broader debate to define and implement the post-2015 development agenda. Within the context of, for example, the New Deal, how is that as a tool or a concept different? And what are the promising aspects of the New Deal? Because the New Deal has also struggled a little bit in recent years. Can you speak a little bit around those aspects?
Okay, yes, thank you. Also, let's say one momentum where we can discuss this is South Sudan, another one is Ebola. No, we can of course positively say, no, that sounds cynically, but it's a confirmation that we can say the South Sudan crisis shows exactly the relevance that we should insist on peace building and state building as the overall orientation, and that we should come to terms to negotiate with the whole country, not only with the government, about broad-based reforms out of the difficult situations. And because the other way would be just to leave these countries, you know, like you leave 10% of your poor and socially deprived people in a country, you just leave them, you give them a little bit something, but you don't really work to integrate them. It's like a worldwide picture in a way. Ebola also, even in a way, proves that if you have a functioning, well-functioning health system, which includes all kind of groups, the chances for an outbreak, and in particular then for this explosion, is much less. So in that sense, yes, we are right, but is it applied? No, that's the problem. And of course, there is an open secret that it's not so easy to really work on the ground for these things, particularly also if some of the G7 plus governments now come back with sort of Marshall Plan-like recovery plans for their countries, which are too much based on the traditional infrastructure, etc. components. So it's an ongoing negotiation, I would say. And now on some of the fragility assessments that were done, and particularly also what individual organizations now try to do, to start from a fragility assessment and to make a relevance assessment, what really should we do in this country, not like earlier in Honduras, build a local water supply system, but to concentrate on something else. I think that is a way forward, but it also shows that how shall I say, that the long-term approach is without alternative, but it is difficult to go. It's clearly, we have now this year a review of the New Deal, maybe this is the last information, so it should be also give us some results of what really went well and where do we have problems, and then we can then see beginning of next year how that way can be forward. If you take it as a template, do this and that, like tick off steps, then it won't work. If you take it as a tool to analyze and orient your organizations, governments, and the partners, then I think there is no way around it.
Thank you. So bringing it back to the kind of Goal 16 context, inclusivity, as you spell it out in the context of the New Deal, is actually the other side of the coin of the peaceful societies.
Yes, sorry, I ran away from your question, but that was not my thinking. Probably like the Geneva Declaration and all the work you did, also the New Deal and the thematizing of this, particularly PSG2, and the acceptance it also got indirectly in the G77 was an important way also towards the SDG 16, connected, of course, and I think we should now not say forget the New Deal. We have now SDG 16 because we don't have still enough at hand, and the indicators that have been proven to be successful in some country situations, or even in the situations for individual agencies or governments, can be a learning field also to feed into the elaboration of the indicators of SDG 16. I think that's the way forward. And if we then have the perfect SDG 16 for the next generation, the post-2030, then we can leave the New Deal.
Thank you. Excuse me. I wanted to see if there was a couple of questions in the audience at this time. I particularly thought about something that Ambassador Wild mentioned in terms of looking at the broader context of human security. And what does this mean to development? Is this an opportune time to see that the silos has been broken down between peace and security on the one hand and development and on the other? What does this mean for development? If there's any specific questions in the audience, and please feel free also to direct them directly to Keith if it's anything specific to the book. But we'll take a few questions before we go to the next question for the panelists. Cécile, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Cécile Molinier. I'm the former director of the UNDP office in Geneva. I wanted to ask a fairly concrete question, and maybe to you, Keith. Let's take the case of Mexico. You showed Ciudad Juarez, that is infamous for extremely high rates of female murder. But there's also the general state of affairs in Mexico, the incredible levels of violence. At the same time, Mexico being more and more integrated into some major economic flows with North America, essentially, but being featured even by UNDP in our 2013 Human Development Report as one of the countries that has achieved quickly fairly high levels of human development. So what is failing in Mexico in terms of policy? There's clearly a link or a broken link between economic development and human security in Mexico. So what kind of suggestions of policy advice would you give in a case like this? And maybe a related question, but shorter. I was puzzled at the fact of the very high levels of violent deaths in Russia. Russia appeared quite dark on the global map. Could you give us maybe some indications, more specific indications about Russia? Thank you.
Whilst Keith gives that a thought, we'll see if there's another question. Please, the gentleman behind.
Yeah, thank you. Violence death connotation with armed violence, and it is firearms. Every time it is context of firearms. How about death inside council, death custody, on detention inside council? Because it's also an obstacle for justice later and the consequences on violence. Second question, how do you see that private security companies nowadays, because they are involved everywhere, can reduce violence deaths, or maybe they can increase? Last but not least, yes, humanitarian context. We are in, I'm a humanitarian, yes. It is natural disaster, post-armed conflict, armed conflict. Yes, do you see that disappearance, it's kind of violence death also? Thank you.
Thank you. And the last question here, before we turn back to the panelists.
Thank you. That's a question mainly on methods for the published work and maybe for your future editions as well. How do you factor in violence, especially against displaced populations, migrants, and refugees, and bearing in mind what's been going on in the Mediterranean in the last few months? Are instances in which migrants drown because of unsafe crossing situations, are they going to be factored in as violent deaths, or does that require maybe another approach to it? And do you think that the phenomenon is going to rise, so that would mean a usefulness in including that in the research? Thank you.
Thank you. Keith, if I can first ask you to elaborate a little bit, and please keep it fairly brief to the questions raised by Madame Molinier.
If you give me a microphone.
Sorry.
Otherwise, I'll be very brief. Yeah, I'm not going to go through all the methods issues here, but I will say a couple of things. Obviously, lethal violence, that is people directly killed in particular contexts, is a proxy for a larger sort of underlying insecurity. We've tried to start to capture, and this addresses your question, violence that's perpetrated by state agents, whether it's legal and legitimate or whether it's not legitimate and not legal, because that's part of the picture that is often neglected. What we did in 2008 was try and also say something about indirect victims of violence, in particular indirect deaths in conflict zones, because the vast majority of people who are victims of conflict do not die violently per se. This is very clear from Democratic Republic of Congo and elsewhere. So I think there are a number of areas to push this, and the one that, when we think of our future agenda, is to focus not just on violence as a physical act, but violence as certain forms of violation of personal integrity and other such things, and that's key to that. I won't say much about Mexico, except that this is a situation in which you have a confluence of forces, including integration on a regional level, economic integration, relatively high levels of growth, and relatively weak distribution. So parts of the country, including some in the very south, as well as in the north, have not benefited at all from the process of rapid economic transformation. And these are some of the zones in which most of the violence occurs. There is also clearly a massive failure of state institutions to provide security as a public good. Whether this is due to insufficient resources or corruption and other forms of state failure of institutions. And I think that's a key part of the story in the Mexican context. I won't say anything about women in Russia because I think Anna knows a lot more about that.
Thank you. I was actually going to swap the order of the questions and hand the microphone over to Anna to talk a little bit about the questions on method, but also if you have anything relevant to say towards the Russian case.
Well, on the methods part, actually, you have seen that Keith has showed two different ways. One explicitly about absolute values in cases where it's very difficult to establish a basis for population, because the problem of displaced people, the problem of changing numbers is really very complicated. This is, for example, a permanent challenge in measuring violence in cities, because what is the actual size of a city? Is the people who live there or the people who work there? So what is the size of Geneva, for example? So indeed, there are some methodological challenges. We are trying to make sure that we capture this by providing the full information that is necessary to interpret. But one interesting thing that is related to the case that you described, my colleague who is in charge of the database really raised my attention to this, that, for example, Italy had a peak in homicides at a certain point. Why? Because one of the cases of drowning of migrants was considered as a violation in the criminal code because it was in territorial waters, and so ended up in the homicide cases. So indeed, this may change the counting in the future, because some of these cases may be captured in the database. I cannot tell you much about Russia. Indeed, this is the result of calculating the numbers on the basis of population. So numbers in Russia are extremely high. They are very, very high for both, for male and female victims. And they end up actually the highest rates in Europe, but also in absolute values among the very high. They are decreasing, but still quite high.
Thank you, Anna. Now I'm going to hand the word over to Neil and Marcus in that order. If you can talk a little bit about the context of the humanitarian armed violence in humanitarian context, as was one of the questions, as well as if, and I know it's not the specific area of expertise, but with reference to the private sector and what you may have to say on that one. So, Neil, please.
I mean, you can look at various, you could say, natural disasters, if that's the word, and the response to them. and compare different situations. I hesitate to say anything about Nepal since Marcus was there, but you have the situation at the moment with this terrible, terrible earthquake between Kathmandu and Pokhara and the well, millions of people who are affected. But at the moment, you can make an argument that in that situation, and you can also use the example of the tsunami that hit Aceh years ago, that you had enough of a critical capital of stability in the country, and perhaps not so many weapons as well, that the opportunity of the humanitarian response brought people together and actually provided opportunities to reduce the drivers of conflict. And it was made easier. I'm not too sure about how many weapons there are in Nepal. I think Marcus can tell us more about that. But you can make at least the argument that that reduces the risk and it makes it more likelihood that something positive comes out of that. The tsunami also hit Sri Lanka, not when I was there. And there were a tremendous amount of weapons in the country that had been purchased, I think, during the ceasefire period. And it was one of the many factors, but I think a key one in actually triggering the conflict to start again and come to its terrible conclusion. If you look in the Sahel as well, you have it's called slow onset disasters from climate, and that's led to these terrible events in Mali over the last years. You can make an argument that even in Darfur, if you go back a bit further, that there was a very strong relationship between climate change and increased tension, and that the increased availability of weapons served as an accelerator and made that conflict worse and made it that much harder to resolve. So I think the point is how you respond to whether it's a rapid onset or a slow onset natural disaster can make a huge difference, whether that's a force for peace or not. But it's made that much more complicated if there's a lot of weapons and there's a history of their use in that society.
Thank you, Neil. Marcus?
Thank you. Yes. Maybe just on Nepal, a few words. Now, first of all, tsunami. I mean, as far as I can see, there were in Sri Lanka, the tsunami could not contribute what we had hoped through the humanitarian collaboration of, let's say, LTT and government plus all the internationals, could nevertheless not contribute to revitalize the so-called peace process, which was more or less already starting to hang. In the contrary, at the end, it was a platform for further division. We know that quite well how it went, so I'm not going into the details. On the other hand, as you mentioned, in Aceh, at the same time, Indonesia, Aceh, it was the other way around. Half of the leadership of the GAM was in that particular jail, you know, where the water comes up and up and up, and some of them came out, and that might also have contributed. Now, I don't know whether that, I have no figures on how many, you know, weapons were around at the moment, whether that had an influence. But I want to spend 2 minutes on now in Nepal, just to say, as an example, how we try to contribute to peace building there and how that could now help with the reconstruction concepts if things go well. Peace building means that you, in every program you do, you include goals that contribute to more social cohesion. That is, for instance, now, and political, of course, that is, for instance, now, have positive discrimination if you hire people for road construction. Positive discrimination, you take more of the lower caste groups, you take more women, of course, to work against, you know, the social conflict, or to take part in the social conflict, actually, if you want. You have measures against corruption in the way that you pay the people directly, not through a contractor, and also the way you construct the roads. It's just now, very roughly speaking, but that was development. Now the same principles you can now also do in the reconstruction work. The other word is state building. Why do we lay such an importance on that? It's not just to work in the capital on a ministry. That's not state building. State building, as we understand also from OECD and in the New Deal context, is to contribute to whole of government, whole of country collaboration that can also be on the local level, just to clarify that. Now, that's my problem here, if I can put my card on the table also. I have not seen so directly, or maybe not observed or studied so directly now the influence of that particular source of insecurity, of armed violence on these type of configurations and the chances to do better. But maybe I should now really read your full report. I will just leave it with that. I'm sure, as you also said, that it sounds obvious, the more, for instance, guns are around, the more, of course, they will be used, that we can see even in our country.
Thank you, Marcus. I think for the benefit of time, and also because some of the things we've touched upon that had to do with kind of the second area that I mentioned from the beginning in terms of Goal 16 and its importance, we've covered some of that ground. So I'm going to pull some of these things together in terms of how to go from here, so to say. What can we learn from these types of initiatives, such as the Geneva Declaration and its work on measurement and the partnership with the Small Arms Survey and the launch of this type of publication? What can we learn from the international dialogue and the New Deal? In essence, data. Anna, I want you to start with this question. Did I wake you up? No. Data for armed violence reduction and prevention, for conflict prevention. How can it be used to develop the agenda? How can it be used for Goal 16 and to measure Goal 16? Is it actually possible to measure peaceful and inclusive societies?
Yes, this is actually the most interesting development, because one of the reasons why in the year 2000 there was no goal towards peace, towards reduction of violence, was a skepticism about the possibility to measure. And actually the work that we have done over the years with the global burden of armed violence was an intentional response to show that it is possible to measure and it is possible to come up with good data that are actionable, that are useful to measure what happens, what works, what is likely to work, and what can be used to monitor and evaluate programs for the prevention and reduction of armed violence. So this is actually now the big challenge at the moment. As you know, there is this framework of sustainable development goals that represents an admirable success of diplomacy. The negotiations advanced quite smoothly, and so we keep our fingers crossed. And parallel to this, now there is the development of indicators to measure all this. That is touching different stakeholders. So most of this work touches on the national statistical institutions who feel it's their responsibility. But for the first time, there is an opening to civil society, to a broader spectrum of stakeholders, including, for example, the private sector, who is also willing to participate and support this process. It's a very interesting, lively, dynamic discussion that is going on right these days as we speak, because it's something that is happening, for example, in New York. There is going to be a meeting of the interagency and expert group for the development of indicators now, 1st of June. And they are actually there to demonstrate that it's possible to measure Goal 16. There are initiatives, for example, one that is UNDP supported, that is the I forgot the acronym, it's SHASA. It is about governance indicators. There are several African countries who have participated in this initiative already for several years, and they are actually the champions for Goal 16 because they want to demonstrate that it is possible to measure.
Thank you, Anna. So, Neil, Marcus, maybe Keith as well. What do we need to do to make this happen? If it's possible to measure, is it universally possible today? What are the next steps in terms of making sure that we can lay out the indicators and a couple of years from now actually be able to read the progress of the implementation of 16 goals of the new development agenda? Marcus, would you like to start?
Yes, data on their own are not making peace, you know. I mean, just for example, I remember well, during and after the war in Sri Lanka, there were clear figures available for everyone, publications, the cost of the war, you know, and it was very obvious, you know, that there should be no war, but that is not sufficient. Just it's the other, but of course, had you had a more conducive situations, these data would have been very useful to be brought into some kind of negotiations. I think yes, the indicators have to be there. That can be objective or perceived indicators. There are different ways of monitoring a situation over time and agreeing on the trend. No, that's what we are talking about. And I would also suggest that the experts, which were just now mentioned, make use of the experiences, let's say also of the development organizations and the governments, because they have agreed on so many programs with indicators, and always you have to start from somewhere. That's what we call a baseline. No, a baseline is very difficult to do in Afghanistan at the moment in some faraway place. But otherwise, it's anyway not serious if you don't have some kind of a starting line and then compare it after some time against what you wanted to achieve. So there is a lot of experience in that type of measuring, not only from academic world, but I think what we see now is that our sector, if I can call it like this, peace building, is still quite young, no? I mean, in that new form since 20 years or something like that. And it is also not so surprising that we are maybe a little bit behind in the exact data and the way we can also compute information as compared to, let's say, road construction or other sectors that have longer been there. So I think we have a good chance to now make progress. And as I said in the beginning, this is one source. What you have done over the past few years is certainly one source that can have influence on these particular 2 or 3 indicators of SDG 16, and hopefully methodologically also on scaling up methodologically, I would say. But you have to work with the experts for that. Better not to work with political actors at the moment. That's why it was separated. And it can also take longer than until autumn. You know, it is foreseen that it will take maybe another, I don't know, year. That's okay.
Neil?
I think on one of the tables in Keith's presentation, when there was an attempt to try to actually break down violence by gender, there were huge holes where that data wasn't available. Yet at the same time, everybody would agree, and I think it is within the SDGs, that you need to make special efforts to reduce gender violence. You need to make special efforts to reduce the use of small arms and the effect it has on women's lives. But how can you actually recognize that goal if you don't actually have statistics that measure it? I mean, these goals are fundamentally about bringing about change. And to bring about change, you need to have a certain amount of political will. That is perhaps enshrined in the fact that it looks like these goals will be agreed on by the General Assembly. I would knock wood, but there's only leather and plastic and metal here. Try that. But at the same time, if you're going to create a dynamic for that change and the support, you need to have evidence, and evidence that can be used, evidence that is credible. And without this evidence, without this data being developed, there won't be that evidence. And it's possible that this goal will end up in a dead end. It won't contribute to the change which is supposed to be there. The fact that evidence can make a difference, I think, is seen in the success, if that's not an exaggeration, of the MDGs in many places in bringing about change, because there was evidence. I was actually skeptical about it when I was, I guess, in Belarus at that time. I thought, oh, what are these goals going to do? And they've actually worked. Even in conflict settings, countries would say, well, we're worried about our education rating. We realize this area of the country is behind. We'll invest in education. It can make a difference for policy. It's going to be harder here because the stuff is harder to measure. But at the same time, the stakes are higher, so it's important that it's done right.
Thank you, Neil. Keith, for the continuation now, how will the global burden of armed violence contribute to the measurements of Goal 16? How can we see that? What are your thoughts in terms of how this can actually help to track this progress?
I think, to put it briefly, and I won't repeat what's been said about data, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for progress. We need, for the purposes of advocacy and signaling and attention-getting, we need global figures that can track on a long-term and longitudinal basis what is happening, and we're already starting to be able to do that. But we then also need, at the country levels, fine-grained and disaggregated data, as Neil just pointed out, that will help you design programs and target them to groups that are affected. Because violence is not something that is distributed randomly across a population that affects everybody equally. It's specific to particular places and contexts. And I think that's the challenge, is to continue the work on this level, which I think is the easy part, and to catalyze the work at the local level, which will involve national partners, statistical offices, government will, and development agencies. And that's a bigger challenge that involves everybody who's going to be implementing Goal 16. I think that's not just a job for us. We can help prod a little bit, but we can't make everything happen.
Thank you, Keith. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to open the floor to see if there's 1 or 2 questions, and I'm afraid we won't necessarily have time beyond that. But we will start with the gentleman in the purple shirt in the back.
A reflection about what can be done and what has been said by Mr. Niels about the work of Professor Pinker about the decrease in violence. You said that we had to put this on that context. I think we should be very careful about that, because Professor Pinker's work, which is based on the work of 2 Swiss professors, Martin Kilias and mainly Manuel Eisner, shows a decrease only for 10 Western European countries and the United States. So these are the only countries for which we have data. Then, in order to see such a decrease, you have to take out all the genocides of the 20th century committed by some of these countries. And you have to take out all the killings in the former colonies of these main countries, which are the countries that we see now with the highest level of homicide. So we should be very careful, because we are always giving lessons. 200 years ago, we were bringing light and culture to these countries, and see what we have done. So now when we go there saying, okay, this would be a solution for Goal 16, we should be very careful, and maybe we should think about the suggestions in the role of economy and the role of financial markets, which largely explain the situation of violence in these countries. Although even if it is not politically correct, I think we should not forget the role that our financial markets and our economies are playing against these countries. Thank you.
I take that as a comment more than a question. Thank you very much for that. If we can have the second one in the back here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. From civilian casualties from every casualty organization. The question is really whether, with the focus, there's no question about the fact that data is important for policy decisions and trends, as Keith has said, and so forth. But the question is, would it not be better and more fundamental to focus not on just numbers, but on casualty recording? That is, recording of the people, humanize these figures so that it's more than that. Perhaps it's what you would call a part of programming or part of what should happen at a nation-state level or lower. But I wonder if the experience in Kosovo and other places doesn't strongly support the call we have to say we should actually agree that every casualty should be recorded, not numbered, but there should be a name, there should be a person, and from that, involve the community in this process. Would that not be a stronger way to deal, a base from which to generate numbers, but even more than that, a positive response to this problem?
Thank you for that question. I will hand that question over to you, Anna, to start with. I think we're going to have to close the circle here, but I will hand the word over to Anna to start, and then perhaps a few words, if you can also conclude any remarks you may have, Marcus, and the same for you, Neil. Thank you.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think that Marcelo, Professor Aby's comments, yes, of course, this is what Keith said at the beginning, that there are ways to look at this rosy picture and it may be misleading. Indeed, what we have seen is that in non-conflict settings, there has been a decrease in violent deaths everywhere apart from two sub-regions, that is Central America and Southern Africa. In these places, we don't see an improvement yet. So we hope that there will be in the future, but otherwise, indeed, something is happening. And as regards the casualty, yes, of course, but I don't think this is the main purpose of the global burden of armed violence. But of course, I think that the work that you are doing is complementary, and it's something that should exist there, and it is a basis informing this type of work that we do there.
Well, I have not much to add except of thanking also again from our side. And the last thought is actually taking from your idea of that record. Now, if we speak about dealing with the past, I speak here about past war crimes, etc., etc., then that recording and preciseness and truth-telling is extremely important for the victims, and then hopefully at the end also for the perpetrators. So in that sense, it's a different way of looking at the tragedy of war, if you want, or of not only war, but of, how do you call that, non-armed? Non-conflict thing. And yes, I think to convince and to make other progress, people need narratives, that is for intellectual purpose, for logical purpose, also for convincing purposes. And there sometimes even myself, I'm not so much a person of figures or not so much used to work with figures. I must also say, taking from what you said, that it will be even more convincing if we can contextualize what the figures, and that leads me then to the end what Keith has said, that this is the easy part, the global part that you said, but then the work to do on the spot in a particular context, I think that can also not be done just by one or by one academic at all, but that is a negotiation process at the end.
So I think what you're referring to is kind of transformative justice and truth and reconciliation, mediation and negotiation talks in addition to this. Neil, a few last comments?
Yeah, human development is about many things. It's about social development, it's about economic development, it's about justice. It's actually about these things that I talked about at the beginning, the 6 elements that make up the Sustainable Development Goals. I think what's important to recognize is this issue of armed violence is one of the elements that can limit development. It's not the only thing. There's issues of inequities in trade, there's investment, there's exploitation, there's the things that the gentleman in the, you call him the gentleman in the purple shirt, had asked the questions, made the points about. All those are valid, but as you can see from the photos behind us, I mean, armed violence exacts a terrible cost. Armed violence affects development. It's fantastic that the world has recognized that through the work, I think, partly done by the Geneva Declaration, partly done by some of the work on INCAF through the OECD and the New Deal, but also through work that the Small Arms Survey has done. So let's hope that this brings about the change which these goals are supposed to be about.
Thank you, Neil. And with that, it only remains for me to thank the audience. I want to particularly thank the Small Arms Survey and Keith Krause, and also all the researchers and authors that I know are here, and also those who are not here, for this excellent product and this excellent initiative, and also for the fruitful partnership, which includes, of course, our Swiss colleagues in the SDC, in the Human Security Development, Ambassador Wild. I also want to thank the panelists, Neil, Marcus, Anna, as well as Luigi, sitting here, and also Michael Möller for his kind availability here earlier today. With that, thanks again to the audience and the panelists.